I'm going to largely focus on considerations about wild and scenic rivers. So as many of you know who have worked as wilderness managers or wilderness resource advisors, the Wildland Fire Incident community has a pretty good sense about wilderness. At least, most incident management teams recognize that things are different in wilderness and that they need to seek out information about adjusting strategies and tactics. And I'm not sure that I could say the same for wild and scenic rivers. My experience as a river manager, river planner, and working as a resource advisor is that there's very little information out there about wild and scenic rivers and what kind of strategies and tactics we need to apply when we're working in wild and scenic rivers. So that's one of my primary goals today, is talk about that issue, talk about Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and why it's important and why it matters on a wildland fire incident. Again, my name's Kai Allen. I work for BLM in Southwestern Oregon on the Rogue Wild and Scenic River. And I think also, I feel like this conversation that we're having about wilderness and reeds and wild and scenic rivers is really timely, particularly considering the fire season that we had last year in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, which had major ecosystem and social effects on a number of wild and scenic rivers and non-designated rivers throughout the state. Tributary watersheds and their watersheds. So, and it looks like we might be in for another difficult fire season again this year. And it also feels to me like things are changing, at least here in Southwestern Oregon and Northwestern California in particular. We've had some massive wildfires over the years that really seem to surprise us every year with the kind of fire effects that we're having, the kind of ecological effects that we're seeing on the ground in terms of burn severity, things like that. So it just feels like something is changing, and so it's timely that we're having this collaborative conversation about resource advising for these resources, for congressionally designated areas, wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. So I've got a presentation loaded up here, and I'm going to turn my camera off and start sharing my screen, kind of go through the presentation. I've built in a number of chat breaks throughout the presentation where I'll come back on and put my camera on and kind of address some questions, but I probably won't be looking directly at the chat as I'm speaking. But feel free to fill up that chat. I would really appreciate getting all the ideas from a lot of folks on this call who have a lot of experience doing this work, both with wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. So thanks a lot for being here. And Angie, I'm gonna, might need your help here sharing screen and turning off my video, and we'll get back to you here shortly. Okay, how you doing? Can you everybody hear me?
We can hear you, and it looks like, there we go. Right now we see it with like all your notes and everything.
Okay.
So looks great.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, this presentation will be talking about fire management on wild and scenic rivers. And I've been worked as a wilderness resource advisor for probably about 20 years now. When I first started as a wilderness resource advisor, it was on a small wilderness fire in Colorado, western Colorado. And there's been huge changes throughout the reed reef community since that time. The integration of resource considerations into incident response and the growth and awareness of resource advisors has really made a lot of ground. I can remember working on fires as a wilderness reed, as probably a number of you have as well, and being the only one assigned to the incident, and really nobody really knew what a reed was at all. There was no framework for data collection. There really wasn't communication channels that were built between the team and a resource advisor, myself. And so I can remember being out on the fire line and having people scratching their heads and wondering exactly what I was doing. So we've come a long way, and though yet I think there is much left to do. The integration of wilderness considerations into wildland fire has now become pretty standard, but like I was saying before in my introduction, I'm not so sure that's the case with wild and scenic rivers and other kinds of protected area mechanisms out on the fire line. And so hopefully through this presentation, we can kind of change that and build up some knowledge and understanding about wild and scenic rivers and fire. And this is a picture from the Illinois Wild and Scenic River here in southwestern Oregon. It flows through the Kalmiopsis wilderness, and the Kalmiopsis in the Illinois is a place that has seen a lot of fire over the years, massive changes to the ecosystem in the Kalmiopsis wilderness, starting with the Biscuit Fire. And this is largely now what most of the landscape looks like. We've seen a conversion from forested old growth slopes to brush and shrublands. And it seems like almost every year now, there is some kind of fire that happens in the Kalmiopsis wilderness. The Chocobar Fire was another large incident. The Taylor Klondike Fire a couple of years back was also another large fire. So this now has turned into an ecosystem that continues to burn on a fairly regular cycle, a much shorter cycle than what it used to. As you know, wildland fire is a critical ecological disturbance process that is part of the natural landscape. And fire plays an essential role in the structure and function of river ecosystems. So for example, fire creates snags and large woody debris, which falls into the river, creates habitat, and drives important sediment processes, geomorphic processes on the landscape for river channels and for floodplains. However, human-caused changes to vegetation structure and forested ecosystems, wildfire suppression, and shoreline development, changing patterns of precipitation are also affecting river systems and habitat values of our wild and scenic rivers. So as we go through the presentation today, here's some of the topics that I'm going to try to cover. We'll talk about the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act itself and some key provisions of the Act as it relates to wildfire incident management. And we'll talk a little bit about fire effects, fire complexity, and river ecosystems. We'll discuss the management framework, the planning framework as well for wild and scenic rivers and wildland fire incident management. At both the incident scale, but also I want to talk a little bit about and explore some of these issues of larger scale fires like we saw in Oregon last year, Northern California. So thinking through about fire as a disturbance regime at the watershed, the ecosystem scale, and what that means for designated rivers. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about the incident scale response that we have as wilderness manager, wild and scenic river managers, and wild and scenic river and wilderness resource advisors. We're going to talk a lot about fire management planning and pre-season planning, kind of that interface between our management plans and incident response. We'll go over the role of resource advisors and river managers during incident operations where there's a nexus with your wild and scenic river. And then lastly, we'll talk about some post-fire management considerations for wild and scenic rivers. So that is post-fire restoration, salvage logging, things like that, emergency stabilization. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have plenty of time to kind of do a round robin and gather some ideas and ask questions of each other. So these are some pictures from the 2020 Oregon wildland fire season. These pictures are all associated with rivers, and here you see a list of some large fires that occurred in Oregon last year, largely after the big Labor Day blow up. Just some serious devastation in both our communities, but also in our river corridors. And the largest fires that we had in Oregon last year were almost exclusively confined to river corridors, in some cases, wild and scenic river corridors. The Alameda Road fire down here in southwestern Oregon was tragic fire. It was over in about 24 hours with 1,000 homes burned, several communities burnt up, and the entire Bear Creek Greenway, Bear Creek Greenway, which is a tributary to the Rogue, essentially burned, including all the riparian areas. So we're seeing some really extreme fire behavior. Fires like the Beachy Creek and the Holiday Farm fire on the Mackenzie and on the Clackamas Rivers, pretty serious effects that we're still working through even now. So one of the things I want to introduce is this notion of context. This is the picture from the air of the Riverside fire on the Clackamas. I don't think this part of the river is Wild and Scenic River. I'm not super familiar with that area. But I wanted to talk about context and how rivers as designated areas, as protected areas, fit into a larger context of influences from outside the area. An incident like the Riverside fire has massive long-term consequences for both people, community, and for natural resources. So just take a look at this picture here and think about all the social and ecological considerations that are influencing this river system and its ability to supply those values, those societal benefits and ecosystem values that we need from rivers. So in this picture, you'll see a reservoir, there's a dam, there's road and bridge infrastructure that has been affected. There's community and a school, and transmission lines and timber value, and tourism, and probably over a dozen different organizations that are now involved with the long-term response and repair from this incident, including effects to the river itself, riparian habitat, things like that, bridge repair, road repair, salvage logging of hazard trees along highways. So fire interacts at different scales, and we're going to be spending a bunch of our time learning about the incident response scale. But it's important that I think that we consider, as Wild and Scenic River managers, it's that we consider the context and management at the watershed scale. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act wants us to also be thinking about rivers in their watershed and how they are managed and how we manage activities at the watershed level to protect and enhance those river values for which the river was designated. We also want to consider how each of us can be effective on this issue. So I'm going to come back to that point that it seems like things are changing. Fire is having enormous effects in ways that maybe are unexpected. And all of us have a role to play in that as Wild and Scenic River managers, as resource advisors on our home units taking care of these places. So how are we going to prepare for these changes, these large land scale changes, and ensure that we do everything that we can to protect river values? How can we work to ensure that the river system doesn't change so much that some critical value or some feature is lost, say a species of fish, for example? These are questions that I hope that you'll consider as we keep going forward through the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to talk about the specifics of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act itself and the provisions of the act that frame resource consideration associated with managing wildland fire incidents and river conservation. So for those of you who are not super savvy or don't enjoy digging into some of the legal stuff here, bear with me. I know that some of this can be a little bit either confusing or sounds boring or whatever. And keep in mind, it's not super important to understand all the details of it, but the intent of the presentation is just to kind of establish that legal framework for considering wild and scenic rivers during a wildland fire incident on our Wild and Scenic River. Okay, so the National System of Wild and Scenic Rivers, this is the language straight from the Act, Section 1 of the Act. where the Act talks about creating a policy to conserve certain selected rivers of the United States for their outstandingly remarkable values. Wild and scenic rivers are preserved in their free-flowing condition, with their immediate environments protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. And again, from Section 1 of the Act, a few other highlights from the Act itself that builds this framework. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is a complement to river development that was occurring through the 1960s and earlier in the United States. And so wild and scenic rivers are managed as a complement to developed rivers in the United States. So the Congress, through this legislative act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, decided that we would build a national wild and scenic river system in the United States to preserve some rivers in their free-flowing condition, protect their water quality, and to fulfill other vital national conservation purposes. And here is a graphic that I found sort of relays the state of the system today for wild and scenic rivers. Here on the left side, you can see the mileage, the current 2020 mileage for wild and scenic rivers in the United States, about 13,000 miles. Next to that is 84,000 miles approximately that are listed in the nationwide rivers inventory. And that's an inventory of rivers that have at least one outstandingly remarkable value in the United States and that are still free flowing. Whereas compared to 860,000 miles of rivers that have been somehow modified in the United States, either dammed, channelized, dredged, something along those lines, some kind of development, maybe a diversion, with a total of about 3.5 million miles of the United States. So what I want to emphasize here is that wild and scenic rivers are really precious resources. They are valuable resources in their own right when compared to the development that has occurred on rivers in the United States. The system comprises about 226 rivers or river segments in 41 states. And this equates to about 0.25% of the nation's river miles are included within this national system of wild and scenic rivers. So jumping into the laws, most of you are probably familiar with. Section 10A forms one of the key frameworks for what we need to think about as we are interacting with a wildland fire incident on our river. And that is what is called the Protect and Enhance mandate. So Section 10A requires us to protect and enhance water quality in wild and scenic rivers. And there's a relationship there, of course, to water quantity in wild and scenic rivers. That free-flowing condition of the river, so the ability for that river to move across its floodplain in an unhindered sort of way, kind of free-flowing and connectivity with the landscape. And of course, what we refer to as ORVs, or outstandingly remarkable values. So when we are interacting on a fire, these are our requirements to protect and enhance those river values, the water quality and quantity to some extent, more related to quality, and the free-flowing condition of these rivers. And then lastly, probably the fourth major consideration is river classification. So there are 3 different kinds of rivers, wild and scenic and recreational rivers. And this classification has to do with the level of development and kind of the feel that you get on these rivers. So wild rivers more equated to, say, wilderness conditions or primitive conditions, scenic rivers and recreational rivers. So there's this scale of development that might occur that you might see. Through regulation, this Protect and Enhance standard was codified as a non-degradation and enhancement framework for all activities that might occur within a wild and scenic river. So this is our goal in management, and it also overlaps with emergency wildland fire incidents. And as I mentioned before, I think I've been on a number of wildland fire incidents where wild and scenic rivers, it just really wasn't very well understood by the team as to what you could or could not do, or they would just have a difficult time even finding information about strategies and tactics for applying incident operations for wild and scenic rivers. So these next couple slides are a few examples that I wanted to throw out there for us to start thinking about common wildland fire situations or tactics that you would see going on in a large incident, and think about how that might relate to our jobs as wilderness managers or wild and scenic river managers and wild and scenic river resource advisors. So the first one is retardant. Okay, so significant biological and ecological effects from retardant. It's a critical firefighting tool, but something that we need to keep away from wild and scenic rivers. In several agencies, in all agencies really, has dramatic effects on fish and water quality. Fireline construction can have major effects to our wild and scenic rivers. So if a dozer line gets pushed into a wild and scenic river corridor, for example, like that would be something that we might try to engage with the team on and prevent from happening, or find alternative ways for the incident to achieve that objective. Maybe we can build handline instead of running the dozer into the river corridor. Aviation operations, so major effects here. You can see an aircraft dipping its bucket out of the rogue wild and scenic river. And aviation and dipping buckets and moving water around can have substantial ecosystem effects on rivers. Here in the Rogue Basin and the Illinois Basin, we work really hard to ensure that water from the Rogue does not cross over into the Illinois River Basin, because we have differences of water quality and aquatic invasive species and things like that. And so rinsing buckets is really important when you're working with aviation in wild and scenic rivers. Another consideration in the watershed or upper watersheds of our wild and scenic rivers is burn severity and burn effects, and what kind of techniques are we going to apply to a landscape in a river canyon that looks like this after a fire's gone through. And what does that mean for us as wild and scenic river resource advisors? What about hazard trees, right? Major concern. A lot of several wild and scenic rivers, many wild and scenic rivers run along road systems where there could be a potential conflict with, say, scenery management and safety and logging, things like that, that might need to occur within wild and scenic river corridor. Recreation and emergency river closures. So on a popular river like the Rogue or the Deschutes, we have to work hard with constituents, with communities and outfitters if the river needs to be closed. Several years ago, we had a fires in 2013 called the Big Windy Fire, which closed the famous wild section of the Rogue Wild and Scenic River for about 3 weeks. And it was a huge impact to the community and to the outfitters, and it closed roads. And it was just a really difficult time down here. And so we now take a lot of care if we need to close the river. We think really, really carefully about the effects of that. And then how we get that information out into the community of constituents that are affected by things like that. How about bridge and road closures? Yes, and when a fire burns through and starts affecting bridges or infrastructure, or say municipal water supply intakes, things like that, might need to be thinking about emergency Section 7 determinations, depending on the scale and scope of what happened in that river corridor. Structure protection, cultural resources, things like this. So again, another important feature, if cultural resources or historic values are part of your outstandingly remarkable values for the river. Noxious weed invasions, post-fire noxious weed invasions, and the spread of weeds after a fire. Some plants in our ecosystems really, really respond to wildland fire. So we need to think through how we're going to deal with that in our river corridors. suppression repair and burned area emergency response teams after the fire has come through that can affect the Wild and Scenic River. Of course, rivers move across large landscapes, and relationships with adjacent landowners and neighbors are really, really important in the administration of rivers. Private property owners, other federal land assets, state land assets, things like that. And so there's a major cooperative element that can occur, that needs to occur if we're dealing with a wildfire that's has an influence with our Wild and Scenic River. And also community relationships. So as we all know, rivers are these really important, heartfelt assets, and we have a lot of attachment to these places, and so do the communities that live along these places and cherish these places for fishing and for recreation and all the things that rivers provide for us. And so one of our jobs when there's a wildland fire that's affecting a wild and scenic river or affecting communities along a river is to interact with those communities and try to work through some of the issues that they're dealing with. Okay, so that was just a few examples of some considerations that you'd want to think through as your as a fire is working its way onto your Wild and Scenic River. The next piece of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that I want to address is Section 3D of the Act, and that is a comprehensive river management plan. So every designated river is required to have a comprehensive river management plan. And comprehensive river management plans or a land and resource management plan are those places where you have standards that describe how we are going to protect and enhance those river values. You may also find standards in the Land and Resources Management Plan for the Forest Service or the Resource Management Plan for BLM, General Management Plans for the National Park Service and other agencies. These are critical resources for setting the stage for how we respond, how an incident management team is going to respond when there's a wildland fire. So for example, when a team is coming in, they need to have boundaries and data layers of our wilderness areas, of our Wild and Scenic River, so that they can determine, they can direct those resources to know where boundaries are, where private landowners are, things like that. And you'll find that information hopefully in your CRMP or in your Land and Resources Management Plan. Other land uses, getting this information to team other land uses, other ownerships within the corridor. On the Rogue Wild and Scenic River where I work, we have scenic easements. We're an original Wild and Scenic River, and so it's really important that the incident management team knows about those scenic easements and what they are and what they mean for us and for conservation of scenery along the Rogue Wild and Scenic River. Also as well, your land and resource management plan will give you some indication on protection standards for your eligible and suitable wild and scenic rivers. Rivers that may not have the full protection of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, but they do have protection of other laws and regulations to protect the quality of those eligible and suitable rivers. You may also find the statutory requirement for other laws in your land and resource management as well. And so remember, on Wild and Scenic Rivers, it is not just the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that we apply to the management of these rivers, but all the other suite of natural resource laws that we work with as well. So National Historic Preservation Act comes to mind. And then, so the important linkage here is with what is called a fire management plan. So every unit, a public lands unit in the United States that has burnable vegetation has a fire management plan. And it is this series of plans that feed into your fire management plan and that also feed into another tool called WFDS. Maybe you've heard that term before. WFDS is the Wildland Fire Decision Support System. And that is where all this resource direction, all this guidance from your planning efforts gets loaded into your fire management plan. And so pre-planning is really, really important. The content that are in these plans and in your fire management plan drives what that incident management team will do and the kind of responses that they will have when there's a fire. Okay, so section 10B and C of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, it talks about the relationship between the Wilderness Act and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And so if you have your Wild and Scenic River flows through a wilderness area, you apply both laws to the protection of those assets. So for Wild and Scenic Rivers inside wilderness area, the 4B and 4C prohibitions and the requirements for meeting wilderness character apply to management of those rivers, as well as the standard in section 4D1, which relates to fire control in wilderness. So what the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act says is you apply both laws. And if there is a conflict between those laws, the most restrictive provisions will apply. So in some cases, say maybe a retardant application, it may be that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is stricter for water quality reasons, or if fish is an outstandingly remarkable value that we're protecting and enhancing, it may be that retardant application falls under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, may be more strict. And then lastly, you want to consider and understand any special legislative provisions that you might have that affect our response on Wild and Scenic River. So in my home river, the Rogue Wild and Scenic River, the part of the wild section of the Rogue River is, it flows through the Wild Rogue Wilderness, but it is managed exclusively under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So the wilderness boundaries come right down to the shore of the river, but Congress said that this piece of river will be managed under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and not the Wilderness Act. So that has important consequences for fire response. Section 12 is what's called the Watershed Management part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, where we are required to take into consideration river values in the management of adjacent and bordering lands to meet the purposes of the Act. And it applies to these other different kinds of rivers that are designated under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act: 2A2 rivers, 3A, Section 3A rivers, and 5A study rivers. Section 12C also directs us to cooperate with the EPA and with the states for the purposes of eliminating or diminishing water pollution. So water quality is a big deal on rivers during wildfires. And the Clean Water Act as well. There's some other sections here. I'm going to go through these kind of quick. Other sections of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that might apply to Wild and Scenic River Management: Sections 4, eligible and suitable rivers; Section 5, talking about congressional study rivers and nationwide rivers inventory; Section 7, related to free-flowing conditions and possibly emergency response, having to rebuild something in the channel of a Wild and Scenic River. And then lastly, Section 11 talks about managing rivers in a cooperative fashion with other political subdivisions. So this hopefully built a kind of a framework for us to think about how we can better integrate Wild and Scenic River resource protection into wildland fire incident planning and response. And with that, that's kind of a good segue, a good place to take a break and see if there's any check-in in the chat, any questions that we can cover.
I'm looking right now, Kai, and I haven't seen any, but yeah, encourage anyone to put any comments or suggestions into the chat.
Yeah, and if not, we'll kind of keep moving along here.
Okay.
Sorry, I've been going a little bit slower than what I had hoped. That was a good time check for me too. So thanks, and thanks for sticking with me. If there's no questions right now, I'm going to keep moving on.
I did just see two come in real quick.
Okay.
One asked if you have a pocket guide for Wild and Scenic Rivers.
I don't. We've got kind of a specific guide that we use for the rogue, but I don't know of a pocket guide like there is for wilderness for wild and scenic rivers.
And then, so if anyone does know of one, please share in the chat. And then also we had a question, would you suggest a fire management section in a CRMP?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, your CRMP should address fire management. Yep, prescribed fire, natural fire. Absolutely. Yep. And, you know, that's a really good question. I think a lot of CRMPs may not have that. They certainly don't have the kind of the most current thinking related to the National Wildland Fire Policy, which we're going to talk about next. So it's good to know that. It's good to know what your CRMP says about wildland fire. Okay, so kind of the next step here is to talk a little bit about the National Wildland Fire Policy. And this is what it says. It basically acknowledges that fire is a critical natural process on the landscape and how fire will be managed. And it includes wild and scenic rivers. As you can see from some of the language here, our response to wildland fire is based on ecological, social, legal consequences of fire. So as resource advisors, wilderness, wild and scenic river managers, we work to ensure that the purposes of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act are integrated into multiple aspects of landscape scale, fire management, planning, and implementation. I'm just going to kind of run through this. It verifies different parts of the National Wildland Fire Policy. Talks about best available science, environmental quality, essential ecological processes. Another important consideration that Dylan raised is that wildland fire incidents are emergency responses. And so they are hazardous operations with danger to life and property where safety is the overriding priority. We're dealing with emergency and delegated authorities. And sometimes, commonly, often, we'll see resource priorities may get overridden in wildland fire incidents. And that's where we as managers, as resource advisors, have a big role to play in shaping strategies and tactics. Pre-planning is really, really important for emergency response. And so I urge us all to go home after this week and look at our plans and think about pre-planning and get our resource advisor kit together and see what we can learn about wild and scenic rivers. Also, as Dylan mentioned, it's a balance out there on as a resource advisor for wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. So trying to find this balance with wildland fire incident response between river protection or river value protection and the necessary fire management activities. And if you do a good job, if you build relationships with fire management personnel, your local FMO, things like that, that can really go a long way at accomplishing these resource protection objectives that we're all about in managing for these resources. Okay, and so I also want to come back to this connection between our CRMPs, the Land and Resource Management Plan, and our fire management plans. So just a little diagram here of the planning cycle for wild and scenic rivers. On the left here, you'll see the comprehensive river management plan for a river, and its standards should feed into what is called the fire management plan. And then that fire management plan plays into, directly addresses incident objectives, strategies and tactics, and the incident action plan. And so, for example, if the fire has a significant consequence with the wild and scenic river, you should see language in the incident action plan that says protect and enhance values of the Deschutes National Wild and Scenic River. Doesn't always happen that way, but we like to see it when it does. And then, of course, this also feeds into agency administrator concerns, resource advisors, and resource concerns on our wild and scenic river. It's important to remember that planning builds our capacity to respond, and local knowledge is critical. So these plans won't have the kind of details that you have about boat ramps and outfitters and historic cabins and things like that. That local knowledge is very, very important when you're dealing with a fire. Shifting again a little bit here and talking about some lessons learned from about resource advisors. And of course, local knowledge is critical to the incident and that incident management response. Reeds and reefs are the primary avenue for how we get those resource considerations integrated into the incident strategy and tactics, and largely in the field. So we talked a little bit about the plan structure, but reeds and reefs can be really effective in the field, working with crews and working with resources. And so our goal in all of this, in our training and our planning, is to try to increase our effectiveness at integrating resource concerns into incident planning and operations. We can be effective as resource advisors when we really work to cultivate our relationships with the incident organization and with fire staff. So I encourage everyone, the more that you can understand about fire and the incident command system, the more effective you'll become. If you can grow your qualifications as a wildland firefighter or a crew boss or some incident operations qualifications, it can really, really help. Talked a little bit about the planning cycle. Take that time early preseason to understand your plan and think about the planning cycle and how you can be effective knowing the planning cycle both on the incident but also preseason. Assign reads early and often. So a great practice is to get involved right at the start when there's a delegation of authority letter. And hopefully that delegation of authority letter will include language about resource advisors and resource protection for congressionally designated areas. This is a really important lesson that I've learned the hard way a number of times is during an incident, the incident just rolls on. You know, it's sort of like a freight train. And what can happen is if we're not prepared, then resources start leaving the incident before the suppression repair plan has been completed. And so as resource advisors, you want to think about getting your suppression repair work done before the resources leave the incident. Elsewise, the fire might get turned back to the local unit, and the local unit might have a lot of work to do on its hands to wrap the fire up. It's all about networking and relationships. So network with other resource specialists who are stakeholders in the interdisciplinary management of rivers, and think about who has jurisdiction over what issues. You know, rivers, we've got, you know, highly skilled hydrologists and fish biologists and archaeologists who are also working within that same river corridor, but they may not have the framework of wild and scenic river management that links it all together. And so those folks are great resources for us. And in a lot of cases, those resources are being protected by those other specialists who are working on your READ team. And lastly, come prepared. The more prepared that we can be as resource advisors, our attitude, our physical preparation are really essential for success and safety and our credibility out on the fire line. Here's another chat check-in. I'm going to keep rolling here because I'm running a little bit late on time. I apologize for that. So this next set of slides is kind of where the rubber hits the road for us. And I'm looking for a little bit of interaction here. Thinking about how we protect these outstandingly remarkable values, water quality, and free-flowing conditions during wildfire incidents. So I'm going to show a number of a series of slides. And We'll look at some common wildland fire activities and then think through what kind of resource concern we have with that activity. And think about the river values, the outstandingly remarkable value that could be impacted and the kinds of things we could do to change the trajectory of those impacts. So retardant. What are the river values? What are the outstandingly remarkable values that could be affected by retardant?
Let's see, water quality, fish, all values, sensitive species.
Yeah, so what kind of alternatives might you be able to work with a team on? Maybe water drops instead of retardant, or some kind of hand line maybe could meet the objective. How about fire line construction or dozer lines? How about erosion, water quality, things like that? Maybe it's OHV use that now enters into the river corridor after the fire line has been closed up. Maybe it wasn't closed correctly. Aviation operations, we covered that one a little bit. How about recreation? Yeah, aviation can definitely affect recreation. This picture here is taken just right above a boat ramp, a popular boat ramp on the road, Wild and Scenic River, that was closed actually during this operation. How about hazard trees? Hazard trees and scenery. So our scenery ORV, are there alternatives to cutting hazard trees? Maybe there's things that we can do before the fire comes so that we can protect trees a little bit better rather than having them burn really hot. Just depends on how much time you have. Bridge and road closures, so we talked about that before in Section 7 determinations. Again, water quality is a concern here, maybe fish values, cultural values. Structure protection, pretty common activity on wildland fires. And so structure wrapping might affect your cultural heritage ORV. How about water tenders and fish and water quality, right? So think about fish screens. Maybe there's endangered fish in your Wild and Scenic River that you don't want to get sucked up into the tank here. So think about fish screens for water tenders. And urban interface. This is the city of Phoenix after the Alameda Road fire, one of the subdivisions of the city of Phoenix. And there were grave concerns about water quality going into the Rogue and the downstream communities from hazardous materials as we entered into the rainy season. So we'll talk a little bit about mist here as we've just got a few minutes left. Minimum impact strategy and tactics. We apply it in wilderness. We should also think about applying it in our wild and scenic rivers. And mist is really about applying the minimum necessary to meet your fire management objectives. MIST is a conceptual framework, so it's a strategy as well as a set of tactics, and it has a whole lot of considerations surrounding it, including risk management, resource availability, cost, different values at risk. And then lastly, thinking through a little bit, sorry, we're short on time here, but post-fire stabilization and restoration. So this can have significant effects, both positive and negative effects to our wild and scenic rivers. So activities, post-fire activities such as mulching, riparian planting, sediment delivery from burned slopes can be a really, really important consideration in rivers, particularly where there are municipal drinking water systems or intakes downstream of the burned area. Usually in these kinds of situations, there's multiple agencies and jurisdictions, communities and stakeholders who are involved. And so there's a major role for facilitation and coordination, cooperation across different agencies and different resource specializations. So just a few ideas in closing here, things that we can do or you can do in your home unit at various levels in the organization to increase our ability to represent wild and scenic rivers during an incident. If you know something about what's called the Red Book or the National Interagency Standards for Wildland Firefighting, wild and scenic rivers are not mentioned in the Red Book. In our CRMPs, we can develop best practice guidance for addressing wildland fire incidents, prescribed fire and fire effects, but also monitoring, post-fire monitoring in our CRMPs, so that we ensure that river values are protected as well as water quality. We can participate as resource advisors and as river managers in local regional READ trainings and refreshers and kind of bring that wild and scenic river component into those training sessions. This is probably a really important one here, is that look at your fire management plan and ensure that the WFDS or the fire management plan includes language that refers to river values and references your CRMP standards when applicable. Building relationships is critical. And then there's also lots of opportunities where we can insert wild and scenic river concerns into the existing things that go on in the bear and the wildland fire restoration community. So that's it. Sorry, I went a little bit over. I hope we have maybe a little bit of extra time to talk about some questions or some concerns. Feel free to contact me at any time. I put my email address on the bottom there. And in closing, just 1% of all the US rivers are designated components of the national system of wild and scenic rivers that we are managed for and protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. And so that is our charge. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you all for your attention and sticking with me on that. If there's any questions, we can open up. Angie, hopefully there's still a little bit of time left.
We've got just maybe 1 or 2 minutes because we do have a pretty packed schedule today. I did put Dylan and Kai's emails into the chat as well in case you think of some questions later on, as well as a link to the session survey. We might have time for one quick question. I guess the one that I had seen come in earlier is from Pete, and he was curious about the value that you see with the U.S. Forest Service nationwide aerial retardant maps on BLMs and with respect to wild and scenic rivers. Is it valuable?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Yeah, it's extremely valuable. Yeah, so as you know, the Forest Service, through its environmental impact statement on retardant use, did some national scale mapping of waterways and retardant avoidance areas, and has a whole framework for reporting retardant applications or misapplications. And so, yeah, while BLM doesn't ascribe to that or the other agencies don't ascribe to it, I think the data set is extremely valuable. Thanks, Pete.
All right, well, that's all I really see as far as questions in the chat. But again, I'd really like to thank our presenters today, both Dylan McCoy and Kai Allen. Really important topic. And again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to follow up with them.